one of the things in that video, okay, that Sagan talks about, he says that because the flatlanders, are limited to their second dimension and there's no up and down, their houses, and this is a great example, their houses would just be little squares,
Yep.
right? Or little triangles, whatever shape their house is.
Yep. They don't need a floor. They don't need a roof.
It would have walls,
Mhm.
but they don't have floors and roofs because there's no direction to look up to see a roof or to build a roof. Everything is perfectly flat, right? And so he gives the example of like, okay, if there's a 3-dimensional, and he holds up an orange, he's like, or an apple, and he's like, if there's a 3-dimensional entity outside of the second dimension, it's above. And when the flatlanders are like, where's above? They have no idea because they can't look up. There's no third dimension for them. They just look around, right, in their second dimension. So if a 3rd-dimensional apple looks at the flatlander in his house, he's looking into the building because he's up and there's no roof. So to me, the second I heard that, I'm like, oh, and he said, and if he wanted to engage with the flatlander and enter into the space, he would just, the 3rd-dimension object would just appear.
Yep.
Because he's coming down from this other dimension and he pops into the second, right?
Yep. So
I'm like, oh my God, that's what Jesus did when he entered the locked room, right?
Exactly.
They specifically say the door was locked in the upper room where everybody was trembling and fearful and praying, and Jesus just poof, appears into their building. That's because he comes from a higher dimension.
Exactly.
And he doesn't need to go through a door. He doesn't need to go through the roof because whatever the 4th dimension is, and just like the flatlander can't look up or point to his buddy and be like, it's over there, we can't be like, well, Jesus comes from over there. Like we can't do it because it's outside of our ability as 3-dimensional beings. But when you see these orbs that are on the news now and that there's disclosures in the Pentagon, Tucker Carlson's talking about them now. If you've watched, he just put out an interview with Joe Rogan where he talks about how he thinks UFOs are interdimensional and spiritual. Okay. It's becoming very, very mainstream now, these concepts. So as Christians, if we don't have explanations for what these things are, these are the guys that are going to run with these topics and give the masses something to believe.
That's right.
Okay, so that's a good intro to what dimensions are. Okay, hopefully people checked along. I think it would be really cool if we had I'll probably link something on dimensions. Does Missler do like a presentation on it, or does he just talk about it? He actually does like a visual presentation.
I don't remember what it's called, but yeah, and I'm sure because I don't think Koinonia House got rid of anything of his, so
okay, cool.
I'm sure it's still up there. But yeah, it's a full presentation. He's got a couple of them, I think.
I'll look if I find something from him. I'd rather link to that than the Sagan one.
Yeah, for sure.
But I'll take what I could get, to be honest. Do you think that there's any? I mentioned one. Okay, Jesus appearing into closed buildings, appearing, disappearing, right? Can you think of any other examples where in the Bible something that might appear as a miracle to the audience might actually be interdimensional interaction?
Yes.
Nice. You're
excited. Yeah, he got
so excited.
My favorite one. And it's so cool that we're talking about this because I literally just did a video on this that's not released yet. Probably tonight after we're done with this, I'll get it up on dailyrenegade.com. But so Ezekiel's vision, and specifically in the first chapter, believe it or not, we actually see an instance of extra dimensional unfolding because there's weird descriptions in that whole vision, and most of the things that we see online, people trying to artistically depict what he saw.
Dennis, Google it, Dennis.
Yeah, I don't want to say that they're like wrong because that sounds mean. Because I had to read the thing like 50 times before I could. There's details in there, but what's strange is it says specifically that these 4 beings that their legs had one sole of a foot. So their legs kind of converge down into one sole of the foot. The wings do the same thing. And a lot of depictions show the wings kind of touching, but when you really look into it and actually go into the Hebrew, and I do this in Cherubim Chariots, again, prophecywatchers.com, it's not just the tips of the wing, it's the wing. Like, they're melded together. And when you look into the Hebrew, it uses a word that means like melded, joined, like there's some fuse, like there's something weird going on. So what I think, this is an example of, I don't know what to call it. It is extra dimensional unfolding, but it's more than that. It's more than just one dimension. So imagine that we have the hypercube we talked about before in 4 dimensions. Now you unfold that into our dimensions, and we have the tesseract thing, the cross with the 4 arms. We can understand that. But now imagine you want to show a flatlander the tesseract. You want to show a flatlander, a 2-dimensional being, what a hypercube looks like. Well, you got
4-dimensional.
Yeah, you got to unfold it again. Well, now some of those squares are going to start overlapping over other squares. They're going to start sharing the same space. They're going to fuse together. They're going to meld together to the Flatlanders' perspective.
Right.
So I think what we're looking at, and it's also really interesting too, because when you really dig into that, these angels have like the appearance of a tesseract, which is kind of cool. But even beyond that, the melding effect.
Yeah.
And Ezekiel wrote this 2,600 years ago. He didn't know anything about quantum physics.
Or dimensions.
Nothing about that.
Nothing.
Like, there's nothing in, he was in, Babylon at the time. There's nothing in that culture that had anything even close to this.
Right.
So he had no framework. He was just recording what he saw. Weird as it was. He was just recording what he saw. And so he talked about this fusing together kind of thing. That is to be expected if these were at least 5th dimensional from the, if there's, I personally, and I could get into why later, but I think there's 12 dimensions of space. But if there's if it's a 5th dimensional being, then you have to unfold it so many times just to get the 3-dimensional being to a point where they can even understand what they're looking at without it constantly changing shape and form all the time.
Yeah.
That you would have some of those pieces look like they're fused together. That doesn't mean that they are actually fused together. Right. It would just look like that. It's a
3-dimensional representation of a 5th-dimensional object.
Exactly. Yeah. But that's also why when John sees the same creatures in Revelation, they're all separate. He describes the same creatures, same faces, but they're all separate, no fusing going on, because that's in the throne room of God. So John's going up to and up is a relative term, but you know what I mean. He's going to this higher dimensional reality, and he said he didn't even know if he was in the body or in the spirit or what.
Right.
But he was going there. He was seeing them in their natural habitat. They're not fused together in their natural habitat. They're separate. It kind of makes more sense.
Yeah, in the throne room of God, so in that dimension, those 4 beings are separate entities.
Yeah.
But when Ezekiel sees them here in the 3rd dimension, they're actually one being fused together.
It looks like that. Yeah.
That's the limitation.
Yes.
They take on the limitation of the 3rd dimension.
You got it.
Because that's what happens when higher dimensional objects or entities enter into lower dimensional space.
Yep,
right?
You got it.
So is that why he talks about like different faces and different?
I think it could be, because we do see those same faces, but in Revelation they're not fused together. They're separate beings. So I think that's why those are fused together as well. I mean, it's all this, and the angels are also fused into this weird, and I don't mean that derogatorily. I think it's awesome. But there's the wheels, which that's a separate class of angel called the Ophanim. And then this whole living construct is carrying the throne of God on this big expanse or this firmament above all of them. And it's all melded together in this really strange description. And the only way that makes any kind of sense is if there's extra dimensions and these are extra dimensional beings. And the really mind-blowing part is the fact that Ezekiel wrote this 2,600 years ago, and physicists today know this mathematically, that this is exactly how this would work.
Right.
Like,
I love that.
And it's been in the Bible the whole time. Like,
Dude, it's amazing. What people don't realize is these were ancient humans, ancient men that were trying to describe with their words from 2,000 to 4,000 years ago, things that they were seeing, which were supernatural, which were spiritual, which were interdimensional, which were alien, which were whatever word, fill in the word, whatever you want to use. These were people that were trying to describe what they're seeing. That's why even Ezekiel, when he's seeing this unfolded being, right, in the third dimension, he's like, it looked as if it were burnished bronze. It looks as if it had the face of a man and the face of an eye. It looks as if it's like this, it's like that. He's using the word like because he doesn't know how to describe it. He's trying to describe it as best as he can with the literary tools he has in his day 3,000 years ago. What would you describe? Like, this is what people today are trying to do when they see orbs and aliens and crafts and things flying around. They're using today's words. They're using dimensional. They're using extraterrestrial. They're using, it looks like an alloy. These are words we have. It looks like an orb. These are words we have. They couldn't use these words 3,000 years ago because they didn't have those words. They didn't have those concepts, right? So they're just trying to relate what they're seeing with the words they had. And we do the same thing. So to be fair, if we lived another 2,000 years, if mankind went on for another 2,000 years, the words we're currently using on this podcast to describe things around us, telephone, computer, whatever, word, right? These would be antiquated words to people 2,000 years from now. And they think we're just goat farmers or whatever equivalent that is today. You know what I mean? So it's really, that to me also is like, was a big revelation. Where I'm like, oh my God, these guys, they might not necessarily be describing, especially when you get into John and he doesn't know if he's physically there or spiritually there, right? I would say he's probably in the spirit. And that's why he sees them as four individual beings rather than any kind of culmination of the beings, is because his soul is in that dimension and he's able to describe them as separate. But then you get in, the throne room, and he's like, it looked as if it were a rainbow and a man made of jasper and a sea of glass. And you're like, those things aren't real, but I see what you're trying to say. You know, I see that you're trying to describe something that cannot be put into three-dimensional words, you know?
Yeah. And it's like, I appreciate and love that so much, because you can tell all throughout the Bible, these people, they're not stupid. They're just trying to, they don't know what they're looking at. Just like if I were to see a UFO do that, I wouldn't know what I was looking at. And I would try my best to not use charged terms like UFO or something like that. You know, I would try to use, I would try to just explain as plainly and simply as I could. And you can see how that concept gets hijacked by like the ancient alien crowd, because they'll say, well, Ezekiel saw a spaceship. He just didn't know. You know, he says it's full of eyes, or John said it's full of eyes. That's probably just windows. It's like, well, no, because in Hebrew they had, I think Ezekiel would have known a window if he saw a window. Like, even if it looked a little different, he wouldn't have said, oh, that's an eye. There was a Hebrew word for window. There was a Hebrew word for door.